Hey everyone, welcome back to Grace Note Forge. So today I'm going to be making a custom wedding band for a good friend of mine, and I really wanted to try something different to make this ring really unique. So I'm going to try my hand at inlaying some meteorite dust in the design, and this is some Mionyonalusta. This is some Scandinavian meteorite dust that says it's from 1 million BCE. So that's pretty crazy to think about and should make for a really interesting ring. So this is the design that I came up with in Blender, and the idea is to inlay that meteorite dust in the center of the band. And you can see I made this little groove here for that to sit in, which is only about like 1.5 millimeters deep. But I also wanted to add a little bit of extra detail around the outside edges of the ring. So I went ahead and used an alpha brush to raise up that kind of filigree pattern and have that go all the way around both edges. And I have that sitting in this little concave channel on both sides. And I did that intentionally to help myself out during the sanding process. I'm going to try my best to not touch this section as much as possible. So we'll see how that goes later on, but first I need to print off this design in some castable resin. And for that I'm going to print this piece in the Jamg High Wax Plus resin that I've been using. And if you're interested, I do have a video review talking about this resin a little bit more in depth. But because I have that detail going all the way around both edges, I had to set up the supports for this print in a little bit of a weird way. I really wanted to print this on its edge, where it could be just nice and flat, but that really didn't end up working, so I ended up just putting some of the heavier supports right in the center, and then I put some of those smaller supports just on those little bits of filigree to make sure that there wasn't any overhangs during printing. So now I'm just going to go through and cut those off using an X-Acto knife, and I'm going to be careful not to mess up that pattern at all, but thankfully this stuff is pretty soft and easy to cut through. So now I can go through with some fine sandpaper to clean up some of those edges. And I like to do this all before the UV curing, just because the resin is a little bit softer. But once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and cure it under UV light for 10 minutes, and then get it sprued up and ready to cast. And to sprue this one up, I'm going to use some pretty thick wax wire. And I think this is 6 gauge wax wire, which is around 4 millimeters thick. And I'm getting it ready to lay it out in kind of a cross pattern, where I'm also putting a 45-degree bend in it. This is just to kind of help that metal flow a little easier and really evenly around the whole ring. Because I have detail in the same thickness going around the entire thing, I really want to make sure that it casts evenly. And I'm just going to go through and clean up some of those edges. And I get asked about this tool a lot, and this is just an old wood burning pen that I like using for melting like larger amounts of wax, just because it gets a lot hotter than my smaller wax pens. But I still like to use these smaller ones, mostly for a little bit of cleanup, and here I ended up using them to just fix those seams and even them out a little bit. the wax kind of shrank in, so I just wanted to fill that section to make sure there's a really good transition. So it's looking good, and now I can just attach it to the rubber sprue base. And I'm using a 2.5 inch solid wall flask for this casting. And I'm also keeping it pretty level and flat. I don't think there's a big risk of air bubbles getting trapped or anything for this one. So now I can just mix up some investment and toss this in the kiln to start the burnout process. So for this one, I used a 5-hour burnout cycle, ramping up to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit for a few hours before cooling it back down to around 900 degrees, I believe, to pour the molten silver. And once the button of the silver cools down to like a dull red color, it's ready to be quenched in water to reveal the casting. So after a quick bath in some pickling solution to break away the rest of that investment, it's ready to have the sprues cut off and then cleaned up. And the nice part about connecting those on the inside means I'm not messing with the pattern at all, and I had pretty good access to just get in there with the jeweler's saw. So I'm just going to continue cleaning up those sprue marks, starting with some rough abrasives and gradually going up. And once it got to the size that I was shooting for, I ended up putting a light polish just for now. I'm going to end up protecting that and probably repolishing later on. But I wanted a nice, even, flat surface to continue on to the next step. Alright, so I'm just about ready to start adding the meteorite dust. But there's a few things that I want to do first just to make sure that it goes smoothly. Because this is my first experiment with this and I don't fully trust my gluing skills, I want to add some wax around those outside edges just to make sure that I don't accidentally glue in any dust over top of that filigree. That would be really difficult to clean up later on if I did. So I'm just using this little hand extruder to press out a few more like manageable pieces that I'm going to wrap around those outside edges. And this thing is kind of hard to use by hand, which is why I have it in the vise, and it tends to work a little bit better if you give some heat to it too. So it started coming out a little bit smoother, and this wax should work really nicely. So I did add some painter's tape to the inside of the band just to protect the surface a little bit, and now I'm ready to start adding that wax around the edge. So I have it mounted in the ball vise, and now I can just start pressing that extruded wax into that little concave section where the filigree sits. And I'm going to even that out in a bit, but for now I just want to make sure that it's really stuck in there and just has a good hold. And from there I just used an X-Acto knife to cut away that excess and make the wax flush with that outside edge. And I did the same with the inside edge, just cleaning up that wax and making it a little nicer. So now I'm just going to go through and repeat that same process on the other side, just to make sure both edges are nice and protected. Alright, so this is looking good. Now I'm finally ready to start adding that meteorite dust. And I have it set up here again in the ball vise, that way I can spin it around a little easier. And I also have a piece of paper underneath to catch any of the loose meteorite dust that I'm sure will fall down. And to glue it in place, I'm just using some regular CA glue. This bottle came with a couple of different nozzle attachments, which help to lay the glue exactly where I need it to be. So I'm just going to go through and lay a couple drops at a time, and then sprinkle the meteorite dust on top and kind of let it soak in. And that's going to be my process for the entire thing. I'm just going to gradually do a little bit at a time and try to fill this entire channel. And at this point, I'm really happy that I went with the strategy of using the wax to protect the edges, because it's really difficult to accurately sprinkle this stuff. It kind of wants to like bind together and come out in big clumps. But thankfully, I'm actually able to use the nozzle of the glue to kind of help spread that around too. So this should work out pretty good. Alright, so once the entire channel has been filled in, I went ahead and let it cure overnight, and I noticed that some of that dust must have shifted right before it cured and made this little glob here at the bottom, which should be pretty easy to clean up, but I want to make sure the top has maybe just a little bit more added to it to fill in anything that moved. Alright, so now I'm ready to start sanding this ring smooth, and I'm going to start by removing that large glob. Now, I don't have a lathe at the moment, but I do have a small tabletop drill press that rests pretty flat on its side, and I just have a little expanding ring mandrel here in the chuck, and that'll work pretty good for keeping the ring pretty center. This isn't going to be as good as a metal lathe, but it should work good enough, and my plan is to hand finish it, so a lot of this is going to be kind of done by feel anyway, so we'll see how that goes. But first things first, I'm going to remove that metal glob with just an old file, just to take that down and get it kind of close to even with the rest of the surface. And once that was relatively evened out, I went ahead and turned on the drill and started filing down the surface by hand. Now, I'm still pretty new to doing rings like this, so it took a little bit of practice to try to get the file pretty flat, and I ended up changing up my technique a little bit just to kind of help myself out, and I'll talk more about what I did a little later on. But it didn't take long to get a relatively flat surface on it. And looking closely, I noticed just a small area that looked like it needed to be filled in a little bit more. I could keep sanding, but I don't want to take too much of the surface off. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in with a little bit more glue and dust, and let that cure for a few more hours before continuing to rough out the surface. So I'm using some pretty rough sandpaper for this. I think it's around 120 grit. And I'm just holding it in place against the file just to make sure that I have that really flat surface to use. And I'm not pressing really hard down or anything like that. I just want to make sure that I'm concentrating on getting that flat spot even across the whole surface. And after a bit, I went ahead and took off the wax covering the edges, just because I wanted to make sure I wasn't filing down too low and hitting any of that filigree. So I'm going to keep sanding down that surface and just checking my edges every now and then to make sure that I'm pretty even and not going too low. And even with a rough surface, this is really starting to look pretty cool with the wax taken off. I think this is around like a 600 grit, but I'm going to keep going to probably around 2000 grit to make that surface nice and shiny. So after experimenting with a few different techniques, the best way that I found to do this by hand was to actually rest the end of the file on the table and use that as kind of an anchor point so I can just pivot my hand and really concentrate on getting a flat surface. You can see here by this angle that I'm also using the light that I have set up to make sure that I have the file lined up nice and flat, and that really helped with staying even while doing this by hand. So it's looking really nice now, and I think we're ready to take it back over to the bench to finish this up. So the first thing that I want to do is actually use some fine silicone abrasives just to polish up the high spots on the filigree. And I'm not really taking off a lot of material, I just want to kind of smooth them out so they really stand out a lot more with the final polish. And next I just want to go around and soften up those hard edges. So I'm using that same silicone bit, but I just bumped up the RPM and I'm just lightly going around adding a slight chamfer to those edges. And you can see that really well when the light hits it. It's just a little added detail that I think really makes a big difference. And I'm going to go around and do the same on the inside, making a slightly larger chamfer, and this is mostly just for comfort, but it also makes it look really nice too. And finally, I went through some polishing compound to do the final polish by hand. Now, I want to darken this piece up with some liver of sulfur, and to do that it's best to clean off the polishing compound beforehand, and normally I would use something like an ultrasonic cleaner to do this, but I really didn't know how that was going to affect the glue, so I just used a little bit of dish soap and water to go ahead and clean that off by hand. And here's where something kind of weird happened. So I set the ring aside to dry for a few minutes, and after I came back, I looked at my little soap bowl that I had, and the debris or dust particles or whatever it is that got cleaned off of it formed into a perfect circle, which was a little odd, but it also was suspended kind of perfectly in the center of the bowl too. So I'm not too sure why that happened, but I thought it was an important thing to mention to my friend before I handed this over. So to finish this ring up, I'm going to darken it with some liver of sulfur and some hot water. And I just dunk that in for a little bit until it gets nice and dark. Then I use some water and baking soda to neutralize the oxides. Then I just went through and lightly polished up those high spots with a buffing wheel to make that filigree stand out a lot better. And now that it's finished, I wanted to do a protective clear coat on it, and this will help protect the surface a little bit, but also help seal in that nice patina. And here is the finished ring. So I really love how this one turned out, and this is definitely one of my favorite projects that I've worked on so far. The detail in that filigree just came out really nice, and that kind of shiny and dark flakes of the meteorite dust I think looks really cool and interesting. So let me know what you guys think, and as always, thanks for watching.